for research. Now, archaeologists use different schemes or frameworks to guide their research. And one example, since we're talking about landscapes, is looking at the very different cultures that have developed at Grand Canyon over the course of 14,000 years in the bigger context of human history and in the history of the environment and the different changes that we've experienced in northern Arizona in the course of that time. And so we have the Paleo-Indian culture, the oldest evidence of human use or habitation in the canyon. Extremely old. The evidence is very limited for how they may have used the Grand Canyon. We only have 2 small pieces of projectile points that people made during that period of time. But we think from better studied sites in other parts of southern Arizona and in New Mexico that these folks were probably big game hunters, and they also foraged for wild plant foods. But they were really focused on the large herd animals that we know existed from those paleoenvironmental reconstructions. We know that they existed at the Grand Canyon, and the Paleo-Indians were probably here for many thousands of years and really developed into a later culture known as the archaic culture. And the archaic people began to diversify where they lived and what foods they ate, especially in terms of plant foods and the game species that they were hunting at the time in the park. But really, it was the archaic culture that has the most lasting power, the most lasting presence in northern Arizona and the Grand Canyon. For almost 7,000 years, they adapted to that environment and probably transitioned into the formative ancestral Pueblo or Cohonina cultures that we see at the Grand Canyon. And these folks, the formative people, the ancestral Pueblo and Cohonina, were one of North America's first farming cultures. And so probably by the adoption of farming techniques and seeds from Central America, these folks started farming the regions around Grand Canyon and then later in time inside Grand Canyon, and yet a little bit later in time all the way at the bottom of Grand Canyon along the Colorado River. This period is fantastic for the record that they left, or that is on the landscape that we can study today. Later in time, the formative farmers leave the Grand Canyon for other areas around Flagstaff and northern Arizona. And a whole different culture moves in, again, hunting and gathering strategies for existence, and with a little bit of farming. A little bit later in time, we have the historic tribes that we know today, the Havasupai, the Wallapai, the Navajo, the Hopi. And of course, we have a historic period that's more recent and more immediate to our present day. And of course, we look at those changes in relation to how the climate has changed with periods of drought and precipitation. And really, we're trying to understand, do those changes in the environment affect how people adapt to the Grand Canyon over time? And so that's how we start to frame up research in the park. And archaeologists have a lot of answers, but I would say we have just as many or more questions about archaeology. And so I've listed some common questions that frame our research. How many ancient cultures are found in Grand Canyon, and how are they, how old are they, and how different are they? How did people adapt to the changing environment through time? How did technology change through time? How did farming come to the area? What is the relationship between archaeological cultures and present-day Native Americans? And what are the perspectives of Native Americans about the archaeological resources in the national park? What was the population of Grand Canyon in the past? Where did people live in the Grand Canyon, and why did they choose to live where they did? And then why did people leave Grand Canyon to live somewhere else? Of course, we don't have all the answers to that. But every project that we do and every piece of information that we gather, either through consultation with the Native American tribes or through analysis of artifacts helps us understand the bigger picture and help us understand little pieces of it, and it fits together like a puzzle. But really, what we have is a sketch of what people, how they lived in the Grand Canyon and where they lived. And it will be an ongoing pursuit to figure out some of the finite questions related to the research. The first project I'd like to talk about tonight is the M&A National Park Service partnership to excavate sites along the Colorado River. And this project started 6 years ago through funding that the park provided to the Cultural Resource Program. And the funding came from the fees that people pay at the gate of the park to get in. And so that money, a lot of it stays in the park, and the park pays for different types of projects, and we were fortunate enough to acquire money to excavate some of the sites along the Colorado River that are in some of the worst condition of all of the sites that we know about. And so the project was focused on mitigating some of the impacts that are related to visitor use of the Colorado River and erosion and other natural processes. This is a picture of when we were set up at a site called Furnace Flats, and we'll talk a little bit more about that site here. This is a project that was supported by a rafting trip directly on the river. So we floated down from Lee's Ferry, and then we would park at the 9 sites and work for up to 8 or 10 days at a time for multiple sessions. And one of the things we learned by excavating those sites is that this picture on the left is before we completely excavated the site. It had been identified and had been documented to a certain degree. But when we really started looking at the deposits that were covering it and getting down to where the features were actually defined, we were surprised to find how well intact some of these stone houses were and how well preserved some of the artifacts were. Looking at the slope in the sand dune here and then out front here, you would have thought that most of the house was eroded and had disappeared. But when we carefully excavated the inside of these houses, and there's 2 of them here, we found intact fire hearths. There's a ventilator shaft here that helps bring fresh air into the house. There's a nice, well-defined entryway here where the door would have been. There were storage areas in this part of the house. And just really remarkable how different we perceive the landscape and then what's preserved under it. Again, at Furnace Flats, the same situation where we had little pieces of houses sticking above the sand and hints that there was a room outlined. And when we started excavating, there were well-preserved walls. And digging a little further, the same kinds of, we call these features, little parts of the house. This one would have functioned as a fire hearth where people would have cooked and heated that space. Very nicely laid out and mortared, in some cases, these flagstone floors. And then ventilator shafts and other features around here that tell us that this was somebody's house and somebody lived in this stone building. Digging a little bit further down, we find some of the well-preserved artifacts. And this was surprising, both for the fact that this cooking vessel is fairly complete. It was buried under the floor, and that's not so uncommon. People would do that and use that pot to store food in, something that's near the hearth and that you could use immediately. Corn or beans or squash could be stored there. But the other remarkable thing about this is that it was buried in the floor and that we had walked across that floor for the better part of a week and did not disturb it. And it was well positioned and well cushioned under a little bit of sand in those sandstone slabs. And when we carefully removed it,